Good afternoon, and good morning or good evening to those of you joining us from other locations and time zones. My name is Dana Stroul. I'm the Research Director here at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I'm joined by the best and the brightest from across the Washington Institute to discuss the critical and urgent issue of the potential for war between Israel and Lebanese Hezbollah. First, let me introduce to you who we have on our panel today. Matt Levitt is the Fromer-Wexler Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute and Director of its Jeanette and Eli Reinhard Program on Counterterrorism and Intelligence. Next, we have Hanin Ghaddar, the Friedmann Senior Fellow in the Washington Institute's Linda and Tony Rueven Program on Arab Politics. Next, we have David Schenker, a former Assistant Secretary of State for Near East Affairs and the Toby Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute and Director of our Linda and Tony Rueven Program on Arab Politics. And finally, joining us from Israel, Assaf Orion, a retired Israeli Brigadier General in the Israel Defense Forces and the Liz and Moni Rueven International Fellow with the Washington Institute. Before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. I have a series of questions prepared for our panelists to go through the most urgent and pressing issues related to every aspect of this conflict. But you all, our audience, will also have questions. If you would like to pose questions to our panelists during this event, please enter them into the Zoom Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. If you are watching this policy forum on our website or YouTube, feel free to email your questions to policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. Again, policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. Let me just very quickly set the table here. The headlines concerning the potential for an Israel-Hezbollah war are alarming. Consider the past few days. The State Department in the United States has increased its travel advisory and is warning Americans to reconsider travel to Lebanon. Other countries, including Canada, Germany, and Kuwait, are encouraging their citizens to leave Lebanon. The Pentagon is reported to be moving an amphibious assault ship and Marines into the Mediterranean in case the U.S. military is called upon to assist in the evacuation of the American embassy. Just in the last hour, reports that the Israeli Air Force has targeted a building with a group of Hezbollah operatives, and Hezbollah has fired anti-tank missiles into the Western Galilee in Israel. Earlier this week, during a visit to Washington, Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant warned that Israel could take Lebanon back to the Stone Age. And Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah has used televised speeches to not only threaten dozens of critical sites deep inside and across Israel, but has even threatened to target Cyprus if there is war. Taken together, these developments suggest that most are planning or expecting that the conflict between Israel and Hezbollah will escalate, despite a widely shared consensus that this war will be devastating in terms of collateral damage, harm to civilians, and the weapons and tactics employed by both sides. The outcome of such a war is uncertain. So to discuss these risks, again, I'm pleased to be joined by such an esteemed panel of experts, and let's get right to it. Matt, I'll turn to you first. Can you walk us through how we arrived at this intense cycle of escalation between Israel and Hezbollah? For the past 9 months, both Israel and Hezbollah have appeared committed to managing this escalation, imposing costs on each other, but avoiding decisions that would escalate to direct conventional conflict. Why is the risk of full confrontation increasing in these recent weeks?
Thank you, Dana. It's a pleasure to be here with Hanin and David and Assaf. Look, I think that there are some people who forget that this low-scale war has been going on since October 8th. And Hezbollah has claimed that it is doing this in solidarity with Hamas in Gaza and has said that it will not stop until there is a ceasefire in Gaza. That de facto puts not only the war in Gaza, but the potential for escalation to full war in Lebanon in Yahya Sinwar's hands, the hands of the Hamas leader in Gaza. But I think most people don't appreciate the fact that there's a pretext to this that predates October 7th. Uh, Hezbollah had for years been distracted by fighting in Syria in defense of the Assad regime. During that time, it didn't do nothing related to Israel. It invested in its long-term ability to strike at Israel. That's tunnels, which Israel largely dealt with several years ago, but also the missile systems. And it was building up those capabilities at a steadier pace, even as it was distracted and its fighters were not deployed primarily in southern Lebanon, looking at Israel, but in Syria and along the Syrian border. And then over the past 2 years, we've seen Hezbollah, as it redeployed out of Syria, try to reassert its resistance credentials and find ways to attack Israel, infiltrate an operative into Israel in Megiddo, 60 kilometers from the border, launching drones towards the Karish oil platform, and a whole bunch of other examples. So that by the time October 8th came around, Hezbollah was very eager for an opportunity to go in up to a certain level, daily firings, mostly of Cornet anti-tank guided missiles, to really reassert its credentials as a fighting force targeting Israel. And so Hezbollah is very, very comfortable with this level of fighting. It's Israel now, to answer the core of your question, why now? It's Israel that is saying we cannot tolerate some almost 90,000 people displaced from the north, daily firing into our sovereign territory ad infinitum. We've offered a deal to Hamas that was basically Hamas's deal, the Israelis say. And if they won't take that, and if therefore Hezbollah won't stop firing in the north, at a certain point, we're going to have to do something. And that point is turning out to be now, as we are just a few weeks from the new Israeli school year, where they want people to go home and be able to register and go back to school and go back to life.
So that's really important context for how we arrived at October 8th and then what we've seen over the past 9 months. Hanin, you run a mapping project here at the Washington Institute. And for those who are watching, if you haven't checked out this map, I encourage you to do it promptly after this policy forum. It documents the timing, location, targets, and weapons used in strikes on both sides of the borders. Since you are meticulously following the back and forth in these escalation cycles, what does your mapping exercise tell us about the phases of this recent conflict after October 8th? And does it offer any insights for how we could de-escalate?
Yes, definitely. Thank you, Dana, and thank you, Matt and David, for joining us here. Assaf, hello. The phases part is very important in looking at the map and understanding the escalation, because it's not just random phases. These phases, especially from Hezbollah's side, because Israel was merely responding and trying to reestablish deterrence. But what Hezbollah is trying to do from the day one, actually, the whole idea that it was involved in this confrontation and linked Lebanon to Gaza, is that because Hezbollah and Iran and the IRGC really need to be part of the conflict, the threat, and eventually the negotiations that come with it. They want a piece of the cake that comes from resolution and have a seat at the table. That was the whole calculations from the beginning. That's why the phases has always been linked to both diplomacy and conflict. First, it's definitely linked to Gaza. Whatever happens in Gaza, the phases in Gaza also reflected in Hezbollah's calculations and escalation. Every time the phases of the conflict in Gaza change, you can see that there's some changes within Hezbollah, but not only that. I noticed also that Hezbollah started using more advanced weapons right after the direct confrontation between Iran and Israel. Like the new drones, the explosive drones, the new weapons, the new missiles that is tried to expose in order to show that even if Iran was not very effective, Hezbollah does have more advanced weapons that they can use, but haven't used yet. And third time when we saw that real escalation finally, that why everyone thinks that this is going to turn by mistake or by deliberation into a full-scale war, is right after Rafah and the Biden three-phase plan. And you see that they realized probably that this is going to be wrapped up soon with Rafah, with the Biden plan. There is serious talk about a resolution. So this escalation is also their attempt in order to say that we are here. Any resolution that would be reflected, that will reflect on Lebanon, because the plan is linked also to Lebanon, that they want to try to get as much from it. Israel has been responding to this, but it's always in both cases, there's always the deterrence and reestablishing deterrence, but also there's always this attempt to make sure both sides that there's a buffer zone on the other side. And if you see on the map the locations, although sometimes they go deeper, but mainly to target certain people or certain facilities. But most of this is that to make sure that Israel's northern towns are empty, and Israel is making sure that there are 5 kilometers around the border that are today empty and not livable. So there's always this escalation in order to compete on whose buffer zone is going to be more unlivable at this stage. I can go more into this, but I think I exhausted my 3 minutes.
Thanks so much for that. So since you talked about the buffer zones, what I'd like to do now is talk about the impact on communities and the humans on both sides of this border, and how societies, both in Lebanon and in Israel, are experiencing this and what they might want going forward. So first, Assaf, and then David. Over the past 9 months, as Hanin said, communities in both southern Lebanon and northern Israel have evacuated. They're refugees in their own countries. Can you speak about the situation on the ground, Assaf for northern Israel and David for southern Lebanon, and what would it take for civilians to return to these communities?
Well, it's an unprecedented situation in which communities are totally displaced, scattered across hotels and apartments all over Israel, losing their community cohesion, a lot of social and economic implications. But the border area itself, like 5 kilometers in and even deeper, is a war zone. So the soundtrack of that is ongoing attacks on both sides, incoming rockets and UAVs or drones into Israel, our own artillery and fighting forces inside there. That's the daily scenery. And well, how do you get them back? I think we need first to take a point, about a comparison between Kiryat Shmona, mostly desolated now, and Nahariya, which was never evacuated. They're about the same size, and Kiryat Shmona suffers almost daily shelling, and Nahariya lives relatively safely. So Hezbollah chooses not to attack a fully populated town at this point, which is a very important thing. So Israel, I think, now regrets the time or the decision of October 7th to evacuate the border area. And the question is, okay, how do you reassure and allow them to go back safely? You need first to stop the ongoing fighting, because you can't live in Metula when twice a day you get anti-tank missiles hitting homes and buildings just out of the blue. You need to make sure that the Radwan units, all the near border threats are pushed away from the border area northward, so Hezbollah will not be there. It's already about 90% less than the opening picture of the early war, because Hezbollah took most of its forces back, fearing IDF attacks and so on. But how do you reassure people that it's safe to live there? So part of it, the IDF can deploy, and already deployed, heavier defensive and heavier forces on the defensive. But on the question of how do you stop a frontier which, as Matt said, is connected to Gaza, actually connected also to Tehran, And how do you make that stop? And how do you guarantee they won't come back to the near border area saying, well, we live here, we, the garrison, are in our homes, and it's legitimate to have a military deployment in the south. That's a political and diplomatic problem, but also a security, social, and economic problem. So it's a vicious problem, like a Rubik's cube, and you need to align a lot of facets to make it work. Actually, most of these, when you look at them, it's very difficult to align. And some people dealing with a Rubik's cube decided to use a hammer instead of turning it and try to fix it in a legitimate and, let's say, less costly way.
Thanks so much for that. So now that we've talked about how we arrived at this moment and how communities on both, oh, I'm sorry. Let me go to David first.
Well, we'll talk about the other side of the border a little bit. Thanks, Dana, and my colleagues. I'll start where Assaf left off, essentially. Israel's goal in Lebanon, as Assaf said, was to end this really, I think, very dense presence of Rueven Hezbollah special forces along the border. Estimates between 6 and 10,000, give or take, right along the border and on bases, places like Green Without Borders, no-go zones for UNIFIL and the LAF, and we can talk about that more later. And to do so, Israel intentionally began operating in Lebanon as it has in Syria since, let's say, 2011, 2013, which was, if you see something, you hit it. And if you go back to 2006, let's say, the last war between Israel and Hezbollah, it was something like Israel was hitting Hezbollah targets in South Lebanon for about 10 days, and then it ran out of targets. And the rest of the war, the next 20 days, there were targets that were hit in places all over Lebanon, including places like Junia that were sort of not Hezbollah areas, no Hezbollah personnel, no Hezbollah assets. And I think what we've seen between 2006 and 2023 on October 8th was that Israel really did its homework in terms of targeting both static targets and dynamic targets. It's done the intelligence homework. It knows individuals, high-value targets. It knows locations of weapons caches, depots, etc. And so it has spent the better part of 9 months going out and after key personnel and after Hezbollah assets in the south. The problem, of course, is that these people and these assets are everywhere. And so, I think just today it was reported that Israel hit 64 sites in one town, Shab. But they've hit all over the south, sporadically in Bekaa and other areas of Lebanon, mostly in the south, but increasingly further north when targets of opportunity arise. An estimated $1.5 billion of damage done to the south of Lebanon so far, and also an estimated 70,000 people who have left, not under government orders, but on their own accord. Widespread damage to buildings, to farmland, secondary explosions from arms depots that cause havoc to the environs. So where do these people go? Once again, this is not like 2006, the war with Israel, when Israel was targeting not only Dahia, the southern suburb of Beirut, and south of Lebanon. So these people couldn't go to Dahia necessarily. So a lot of people went to other places in Lebanon and to Syria. But in the aftermath of Hezbollah's joining the war in support of Bashar al-Assad and killing the better part of 500,000 people in Syria, and Syria is still in a bad condition. These people are not going to Syria. They're in Lebanon, many at relatives' homes elsewhere, but also in facilities in Lebanon, government facilities, shelters, etc. And you can read about this with some frequency in Al Akhbar, Hezbollah's hometown newspaper, where they talk about that the government isn't providing gas for generators in these facilities, that the quality of life is quite poor and difficult. And there's a lot of grumbling about that. But let's just say there's a lot of I think dislocation and suffering as well in South Lebanon. But unlike Israel, there's no pressure that we're hearing from Hezbollah's constituents to end this or to get them back home. We're starting to hear the grumbling from other people in Lebanon, but not specifically, as far as I can tell, in a concerted way from this constituency.
Thanks so much to both of you. So now we're going to turn to what this conflict could look like if it escalates. And I'm going to ask Matt to talk about it. So first of all, given some of the statements coming from Israeli leaders, can you give us your assessment of how Israel would craft this campaign? What is it going to target in Lebanon? What does victory look like or success look like from an Israeli perspective? There are also discussions about the kinds of weapons that Hezbollah would employ in this conflict, speculation that Israeli air defense could be stressed to protect civilians and critical infrastructure. What does success or victory look like from Hezbollah's perspective? And then finally, if you can share some thoughts on if there is this war, how will it compare to what we have just seen in Gaza over the past 9 months?
Those are three big questions. So first of all, let's start where you ended. The potential, if there is a full-scale war between Israel and Hezbollah, is for it to be something of orders of magnitude bigger, more dangerous than what we have seen in Gaza. That says a lot. Hassan Nasrallah, the Secretary General of Hezbollah, has warned that if there's war, that Hezbollah will fight with no limits, with no rules. As you mentioned in your intro, the Israelis have said they would send Lebanon back to the Stone Age. Several months before October 7th, there was this kind of childish two kids in the sandbox thing between Israeli leaders and Hezbollah leaders, where day in, day out, they would threaten that Stone Age thing. There are some Israeli military leaders who say it may not go on a 1 to 10 scale from 0 to 10 right away. And maybe there could be additional phases of the type that Hanin was discussing, where they could escalate but not go in too much further. The U.S. administration has been warning that the U.S. intelligence community is concerned that you can't do this in phases, that if you start something, it'll spiral very, very quickly. And that in part depends on how Hezbollah responds. Hezbollah releasing drone footage of critical infrastructure and Haifa, et cetera, is supposed to be signaling in that direction. So what would victory look like for each? In part depends on how they fight. For Hezbollah, at the end of the day, victory is remaining standing and not being destroyed. Being able to point to Israel when Lebanese say, "Look at all the destruction that was just created on the heel of a massive economic crisis," which is why I think the overwhelming number of Lebanese don't want this war, and Hezbollah is concerned about that. At the end of the day, if everything ended today, Hezbollah would have this huge propaganda piece, which they would claim as part of their victory. We've been telling you for a long time we're eventually going to liberate, they would say, the Galilee. Now we have just cleared the Galilee of Jews for whatever it is, 8 months. Next time we're going to do it permanently. So long as they are not fully destroyed, and they wouldn't be in a big war, they would claim their divine victory as Nasrallah did in 2006. For the Israelis, ultimately, victory is being able to push Hezbollah back, destroy their capabilities, enough of their rocket arsenal so that they can repopulate the north. They need the people to be able to go back to their homes in sovereign Israel without threat of being shot at on a daily basis. And I don't think that Israel here in this war is going to be trying to destroy all of Hezbollah, which is good because that's not an achievable goal. They'll be trying to destroy enough of their fighting power to make it so that people can go home north. This is what Israeli officials have said very clearly for the past few months. If we can achieve that goal through diplomatic means that the US and Germany and France have all been pushing to get Hezbollah through negotiations to redeploy, as it were, fine. If we can't, the Israelis have said, then we're going to have to do this through other means because the people have to go home.
Thanks so much for that. And I would just note here the idea of destroying much of Hezbollah's fighting power is very similar to the military objectives identified by Israel for its campaign in Gaza, which has obviously proven much more difficult than we understood in October. And the same thing on the Hamas perspective. For Hamas, victory is to survive. So what this incentive structure looks like on both sides, I think is quite concerning for how either side calculates its decisions going forward. So Matt, I'm going to ask you another question. Then I'm going to send it out to Assaf and then go down the panel for anyone else who would like to respond to this question, because another dynamic here is whether or not Iran enters the conflict, should it escalate. So you talked about what Israel might do and what Hezbollah might do should this escalate. But we've seen warnings even from U.S. officials about Iranian decision-making from Tehran. Can you share your thoughts on factors that would prompt Iran to enter the war on behalf of Hezbollah?
So I like the way you asked the question, Dana, because there are factors in both directions. I think a lot of people assumed that Iran would not enter a war because Iran throughout this whole period has been escalating on the nuclear file. One of the reasons people have thought that Hezbollah really doesn't want a full-scale war is A, the economic crisis at home, but B, that Iran really wants the powder dry so that Hezbollah's capabilities are there to deter Israel or anybody else from attacking Iran's nuclear program, or so it's there for a second strike capability. But on April 13th and 14th, Iran demonstrated that it is willing to do things that we never thought it would do before, getting directly involved. And if it got to the point where Iran felt that one or more of its proxies, the lesser, smaller proxy in Hamas, or the most prominent of its proxies, Hezbollah, was either about to be fully destroyed or put out of commission or significantly undermined in the case of Hezbollah, then there's a greater likelihood that Iran does something. Is it a one-off? Is it getting all the way engaged in the war? I think the latter only happens if you go down a slippery slope through miscalculation, but that is a significant concern. The past 8 months have shown that Iran, one of its successes has been testing and implementing its idea of uniting the fronts, that if one of its proxies is engaged in a conflict, all of them get involved. So we should expect that the Houthis would fire things and the Iraqi Shia militants would fire things, etc. And there's a possibility that Iran would do things. And by the way, not just in terms of the war, that either Iranian operatives or Hezbollah operatives could do things abroad, like the Hezbollah cell that was recently arrested and thwarted in Brazil.
Thanks. Assaf, over to you. Iranian calculations.
I would say that I think we need to recognize that we might be in a new period, a new age of Iranian and the axis of resistance, boldness and brazenness, and appetite for risk and aggression. Starting with the October 7th by Hamas, joining by Hezbollah and not stopping, even at the risk of a coming war. Of course, the Houthi and the Iraqi side, mid-April attack, which was, I think, out of what we were used to assess about Iranian risk-taking. So I think we need to understand that we may be now already in a new campaign being run and waged, orchestrated by Tehran, and occasionally participated by the different members. So I wouldn't rule out Iran joining in. I would be cautious against an all or nothing, stay out or do an all-in. I would take this brazenness definitely into the field of nuclearization, can quite easily within some fragile window go for it when America seems distracted or otherwise busy doing other things. So I think we need to be open to the fact that we're in a different period. That's no longer Kansas, to say it from the wizardy side. So I think we need to recognize the fact that although parties would not like to go to war, they can actually quite easily stumble into it. The options are getting thinner. There are too many alternatives that are not really in our hands, like, okay, Gaza ceasefire. That's not a viable option, maybe. So continuing what we do now, that might lead to war anyway. Go straight to war, which would be devastating, and trying something small, to rattle the cage and alter the trend is also quite problematic. But I think all bets are off. It's not going back to 2006.
So what I have heard from both of you is an alignment on the view that as we think through Iranian calculations with respect to stepping into an Israeli-Hezbollah conflict, we have to think about both the post-October 7th and the post-April 13th strategic environment, and that we're seeing increased brazenness and risk-taking tolerance from Tehran. So I'd like to invite Hanin and then David to also comment on this critical issue.
Yeah, definitely it's linked to Hezbollah's calculations. If you want me to talk about Hezbollah's calculations now or later, I can link it together, because I think that the way I see it is that in terms of how Iran sees Hezbollah, the perspective of Hezbollah is not just a proxy like the Shia militias of Iraq or client as Hamas or it's not just a proxy, right? What Qasem Soleimani did during the Syria war, what happened really is that they turned Hezbollah to become the core of the Quds force of the IRGC. Hezbollah is very much integrated, organically linked to the Quds force, in the sense that Iran is involved. When Hezbollah is involved, it's not like Iran is managing Hezbollah or Iran is giving orders to Hezbollah. It doesn't work like that. Hezbollah is part of the system, is part of the decision-making. They are trusted to make many decisions in Lebanon in coordination with the Quds Force structure. This is how it works. It's not a distant proxy. So if you think about it this way, and there are many indications that actually Hassan Nasrallah himself has said it many times, that this is how it functions. It's not like a state giving orders to a proxy. This is not how it works. So in this way, Iran is directly involved, but not with missiles flying from Iran to Israel. And I think when this happened, it was a kind of a message from Iran saying that we can do that now. We don't want to do that, but we can do that now. And this is how I think what's likely to happen. Of course, there's, as Assaf said, we cannot rule this out. Iran might be involved, but I think Iran will be only involved if it feels, like Matt said, a direct threat to its nuclear program or to a direct threat to the regime itself. These are the main two priorities that Iran really cares about, and I think they will be involved when they feel the direct threat to Iran itself. If not, I think what they're doing today, and they have made many statements coming from Iranian officials saying that they are not part of the conflict between Hezbollah and Israel. They're distanced themselves many times from this conflict, and I think they would like to keep distancing themselves from this conflict until they feel that the threat is too direct. What they're doing through Hezbollah, and I think because Qasem Soleimani changed Hezbollah's mission and priorities, which was before merely Lebanese resistance group that worked within Lebanon with some role in the region, but not mainly. But today, Hezbollah's role and mission and priorities completely shifted in Syria with Qasem Soleimani, and their mission today, they are acting as Matt hinted at it, but I would call it Iran's insurance policy or defensive shield. If Iran feels this is not their war, let's remember that Hassan Nasrallah's first speech, the first thing he said when he came out after October 8, 4 weeks after October 8, the first thing he said that this is a Palestinian war, this is not our war, we're only here to support. This is not their war, and they don't want to lose everything for this war. Their assets, which they haven't used yet, and you're talking about the precision-guided missiles, we're talking about the thousands and thousands of long-range missiles, not going into the military details here, but these will only be used if Iran is under direct threat. Their priority is to protect themselves, of course, but themselves as an Iranian asset. And I think this is their main calculation. If let's say that they go for war, if let's say they made this decision, if Israel made this decision, then they will have to defend themselves. But let's say they made this decision today, Iran and Hezbollah as a Quds force, to go actually and launch a war against Israel, launch all these thousands of missiles every day. The way we see it is that thousands of missiles falling on Israel. We see precision missiles targeting certain vital infrastructure in Israel. And then what happens? They will lose these assets. Iran will be exposed. This is their main calculation. They need them. The threat of their weapons is today stronger than the weapons themselves because it's not going to be easier to restock. This is their main calculations today. They don't want Iran to be exposed. They want to be more prepared. And they cannot today really sacrifice their assets for Gaza. They will only use their assets to protect Iran or themselves, but not Gaza, not the Palestinians. This is not their mission, not their priority today.
David, very interested in your thoughts on this issue. We've gone from increased Iranian risk tolerance to their calculations being informed by perceptions of a threat to the regime. So when Hassan Nasrallah threatened Cyprus in a recent speech, given what Hanin said about the relationship between Hezbollah and the IRGC, that it's different than other proxies. Is that Iran threatening Europe? Talk to us about your views on Iranian calculation with respect to this conflict.
Goodness, I think the threat towards Cyprus was somewhat of a surprise. This is a long-standing relationship between Israel and Cyprus. But for Nasrallah and Hezbollah, and by extension, Iran, because we are talking about an Iranian proxy here, to threaten Europe directly, the EU. This is far beyond going after Israel. The willingness to basically threaten the whole European Union, to take on the whole European Union, which has been not particularly hostile, I'd say, toward Hezbollah. Many of these countries do not consider Hezbollah to be a terrorist organization formally. They're not taking active steps. They still engage politically with the organization. I think many were sort of mystified by this. But it's, of course, part of a broader Iranian and Hezbollah threat against the Mediterranean, which is not only to intimidate European diplomats and European involvement in support of Israel, but to actually lay down a marker of the kind of damage that Hezbollah can do in the Mediterranean, much like the other Iranian proxy, the Houthis, have done in the Red Sea, right? Basically paralyzing global commerce, raising the price of energy, of commodities. This is enormous impact. Not only do the Iranians control the Straits of Hormuz, They also control the Bab el-Mandeb now, two of the key choke points for energy and commerce in the Middle East, if not the world. So this is a little bit of muscle flexing. I think something that took many aback and sort of got lost in the sort of wider buildup toward the Israel-Hezbollah potential war, but something that should make all of us, I think, pause and get serious about how we view Hezbollah and how Europe views Hezbollah. I was going to say before, just one last point on the first question. In the region, when Hamas went to war with Israel, this was after a period that Nasrallah and many other groups in the region pointed to, and Iran, of what they saw as damaging societal divisions within Israel. After a year of protests related to the judicial reform, now, if you listen to some of these groups, they talk about divisions in the aftermath of October 7th, about military service, about Netanyahu, even pointing to the Gantz resignation, the differences with the defense minister and the prime minister. They point these out. As many of you know or might know, we had some TV program here last night that many of us watched. We're in the middle of election season already, and maybe also somewhat distracted. I think we can should expect an increase in operational tempo, certainly of the Hashid, the Iranian-backed Iraqi militia, toward Israel, drones, missiles, etc., being fired perhaps out of Syria, certainly also out of Iraq, but likely an increased operational tempo of the Houthis in Yemen, firing toward Israel. They're increasingly, I think, feeling their oats, having great success in damaging shipping, passing through the Bab el-Mandeb and the Red Sea. As for Iran, this is the wild card, what Assaf would call the Black Swan incident. We saw it on April 13th. I think both Iran and Hezbollah are just fine with the way things are going right now. They're doing great, right? They see divisions between the United States and Israel. They see Israel in diplomatic space being isolated. They see the buffer zone in northern Israel. That's been unprecedented. And they can go on like this for a long time. They're not a democracy. They're both Hezbollah and Iran authoritarian governments. They don't care about the disposition of the 70,000 people in South Lebanon that had to leave. They can go on like this indefinitely. And so Iran doesn't have to force the action here, but they could.
So this has been, frankly, a terrifying laydown of the wicked incentive structures when it comes to Hezbollah and Iranian calculations. So Assaf, I'd like to go out to you now and talk to us about, given what we've talked about, the threat environment, the decision-making, the level of comfort that Hezbollah and Iran feel at this point in time, and a view that the U.S. lacks resolve when it comes to addressing this set of issues and preventing this war. Talk to us about the strategic choices and decision space facing Israel.
Well, I think what we heard, all along the panel is actually Iranian and Hezbollah hubris and overconfidence. And there's a basic fault in when you use linear thinking along a strategic dynamic curve, because at some point there is an inflection point and something changes. Like you continue overloading something so much and you say, so far so good, but at some point something snaps. Now it can go several ways. One, maybe less probable, that Israel will decide to go for a full-fledged war to reestablish its deterrence, to allow the return of our internally displaced, to seriously degrade Hezbollah capabilities and to push them back seriously. Now, we just heard today that Minister Gallant came back from Washington saying, well, if we're able to reach an agreement and push back Hezbollah from our border, so be it. But if not, we need to be ready for other options. So when you look at Israel's tree of decisions, you can, as I said, you can continue to pray for a ceasefire in Gaza, but usually strategic aspects don't follow just a prayer as a policy option. Most chances are that we don't have it because Hamas is also very comfortable with the current situation. Second, as I said, is to continue as we go. That means to keep on degrading capabilities mostly near the front line, but also what my colleagues mentioned about attacking in depth. It's usually going for quality issues, for air defenses, for production facilities, for logistics, for advanced weapons. And in those, it usually draws stronger or deeper Hezbollah reactions. So we already saw attacks up to the Haifa line, but not going after Haifa itself. So the minute you delegate those authorities to weapon systems, you leave it to the lottery of weapon statistics. If you kill one or you kill 10 or you hit a kindergarten, it's all the same rocket, but totally different implications. At some point, I think the government will say enough is enough. I'm not going to allow this, and we need to break the mold. We need to keep in the back of our heads or our minds that Gaza is moving from phase 2 to phase 3. Less demands on maneuvering powers, less demand on intelligence assets. So at last, after October 8th, or we actually have our marching orders, the war goals were set on October 16th, saying main theater of operation is Gaza. Secondary is the north. I think you hear the Israeli discourse today saying, okay, it's about time to move north, to bring more forces forward, to put a real choice between for Hezbollah between continuing this and going to war or to something of a high escalatory level, or stopping it under some excuse, climbing down the tree. And there's the diplomatic option, supposedly, to go discuss it and to re-implement 1701, but this time for real. Like this time, it's supposed to work. Why? And I think on this we owe ourselves candid answers. It's a good thing to have a ceasefire. It's a good thing to stop the escalatory dynamic, but I think we need to be candid about the capability of diplomatic agreements to bring Israel the results it wants. South of the Litani, without military assets other than those of the government of Lebanon and UNIFIL, and something to address the huge threat from the depth, mostly the firepower, the precision, the UAVs, and so on, all dependent on a whim of Tehran or Nasrallah. And after October 7th, we're much less, let's say, comfortable with living under a threat like that.
So thanks so much for that. What we're going to do now is shift to policy approaches and options if there is still opportunity and space to de-escalate. So David, I'm going to start with you. After October 7th, you saw these clear lines of effort by the administration here to make it clear that the U.S. unequivocally supported Israel's ability to defend itself, and to both through messaging and posture and other activities signal to adversaries like Hezbollah that they shouldn't think about escalating. So we've seen some of that, especially during Gallant's visit to Washington. And now we're seeing discussions of increased posture in order to deter or message to Hezbollah and also to Iran. But talk to us about whether the actions to date are sufficient. Are they going to deter adversaries who are considering escalating against Israel at this point in time? What more should the United States be willing to put into this to prevent this war? And then the other side of the question, because I think a lot of Americans are thinking about this, is it in our national interest to get involved more deeply in this conflict and in the Middle East? If we need to support Israel's defense, how deeply is the United States, or could the United States get dragged into a regional war in the Middle East?
Well, Dana, we could have a whole panel on that question.
But you only get 3 minutes.
Right. So, listen, the U.S. envoy Ahmed Hochstein was just in Lebanon and reportedly told the government of Lebanon, such as it is, that the United States didn't want a war between Hezbollah and Israel, but that if there was a war, that the United States would stand by Israel and wouldn't prevent them from doing what's necessary to secure Israel. And this was conveyed indirectly to Hezbollah. They got the message via Nabi Berri, the Speaker of the Parliament. The messaging, I think, has been pretty clear, although the United States has also spelled out that there's certain limits to the type of missile defense that we can provide in between if there's a war between Israel and Hezbollah. That said, there's a lot that we can do if we have the assets in the area, continued intelligence support. Now that if there's a war, I think Hezbollah will roll out its anti-aircraft systems, additional surveillance. We do have destroyers that can improve the regional radar picture for Israel. We can expedite arms shipments. I think those are all things that are in the cards. And it would be difficult to do so because, of course, the Red Sea is closed and much of the Med may be closed, as well as Ben Gurion Airport. But we could do these things. And this is not, when we talk about what we're going to do for Israel, some of this is what we're going to do for ourselves. The issue with the Houthis, if there's a war, I'm confident the Houthis will be more engaged. And we have been involved since Prosperity Garden, since November, December, in working to secure the Bab el-Mandeb in the Red Sea for international commerce. And somehow, and I think it's because of our resourcing issue, we haven't yet been able to degrade the Houthis in a serious way. And this gets to your question about whether it's in our interest. And this is why this would be a wider panel. But is it in our interest to continue our role internationally in ensuring the rules-based international order and things like freedom of navigation that we have done? I would make the argument that it is, but it's also that we're going to need something that we haven't had, which is a coalition of the willing rather than the unwilling. That is more burden sharing, more allies who actually agree with the need to ensure freedom of navigation, and will devote resources, financial, put their people at risk to do this work. We all have less ships in our navies. We all have assets that we need to deploy to Asia. We don't want to be dragged into a war. We'd prefer that there's not a war. Israel can fight the war against Hezbollah with U.S. support. But it's going to be our job to do the work in the Red Sea. And we're going to have to work out something where Israel can go take care of other problems, like in Iraq, where we're not going to be blamed for it.
So David, I think, very thoughtfully laid out the different kinds of efforts and discrete actions that the United States could be doing, including resourcing at this moment in time, both for the region, for the rules-based international order, for U.S. national security interests in a stable Middle East broadly. There's also been some very targeted diplomacy, specifically on Lebanon, Hezbollah, and Israel, led by President Biden's special envoy, Amos Hochstein. So what I'd like to do now is go down the line and invite each of our panelists to share their thoughts on the U.S.-led diplomatic play, also French-led efforts to de-escalate this situation. So Matt, starting with you, how likely is Mr. Hochstein's diplomacy to succeed?
I wish him the best of luck for all of our sakes, but none of us are sitting back and assuming that he will be successful. As Assaf said, I think that there's a mistake in putting all your eggs in the diplomatic basket at this point, given the experiences we've all had over the past 8 months. And again, we kind of have a situation where Nasrallah has dug himself into a corner, saying this is in support of Hamas. I'm going to keep doing this until the fighting in Gaza ends. And Sinwar rejecting a deal he once accepted. So you basically have Yahya Sinwar being able to veto any diplomatic effort in the north right now. The prospect for success comes down not to the strength of the diplomatic effort alone, but the credibility of the military threat. If Hezbollah truly believes that if they don't come up with some type of diplomatic solution where they actually get something too, that Israel's going to come in and really kick the stuffing out of them, and that the West is going to have Israel's back because this is a defensive war, maybe that'll change. I don't know how confident we can be in that. I think the biggest hope is that there is some type of breakthrough in Gaza, and that gives Nasrallah the opportunity to save face and say, well, if there's a pause there, I can pause here. But again, we can't rely on that. If I can piggyback on David's comments, I agree with everything he said, but I think that there are two other things that we can do. One is, as David mentioned, U.S. military has been very clear that the kind of coordinated air defense that we did on April 13th, 14th wouldn't work as well with these shorter range rockets across the border between Lebanon and Israel. But we discussed earlier the possibility of Iran entering the war, and we can A, articulate, hey, we're here, don't, and B, should Iran do that, again, we could perform that kind of integrated air defense again, if we had to, if it came to rockets or other munitions coming from Iran or from Iraq or from the Houthis. And the second is, at the end of the day, I think one of the most critical reasons we have not been successful with the Houthis and others is because we have not yet made the decision to proactively target supply routes and logistics. Yeah. If we did that, and that may include hitting some Iranians, if we did that, we would have much more success with the Houthis. We would need to do that to make sure that if Hezbollah got involved, Hezbollah couldn't resupply and would understand that this is now our new normal. Their new normal may be uniting the fronts, but our new normal is we're not going to just bank on a 1701 to assume resupply won't happen. We're going to make sure it won't happen. Right now, Iran is able to not only finance, but provide arms to all of its proxies, and it'll continue to do that until someone makes it too difficult for them to do it.
All right. I totally agree. Supply routes, and this really what segue into exactly what I wrote back in February, reinforcing diplomacy, the policy note on reinforcing diplomacy, U.S. diplomacy to avoid a war between Hezbollah and Israel. And I think there are always, in every kind of conflict like this, there's always this short-term solution and a long-term solution. Short-term solution is always about how to reach a ceasefire. Sometimes the ceasefire is enough, and then it's a temporary ceasefire until the next war. And this seems what is going on right now. on whether the French diplomacy or the US diplomacy, it's always focused on either 1701 or part of 1701, which is always providing a very temporary solution if implemented. That's the problem, that these solutions that are offered by the diplomacy today are solutions that have already been tried 17 years ago, post-2006. 1701 was implemented, and 1701 stipulated that Hezbollah does not exist militarily south of Litani. And everybody agreed to that because both parties wanted ceasefire. And then it was very temporary. Hezbollah sneaked back in. The Lebanese army and the UNIFIL, who were tasked with actually monitoring and implementing 1701, did not have the prerogatives to actually do anything. And 1701 itself did not include any punitive measures. So it was just an excuse to reach ceasefire. The problem with that is that this allowed, yes, peace along the border for 17 years, but also allowed Hezbollah to increase its military strength, redeploy itself along the border, get more weapons, advance its weapons. This was great for Hezbollah. Yes, it provided peace along the border, but it really didn't, it only gave Hezbollah time to get ready for the next round. And today they are ready for the next round. They have better weapons. So again, to this idea of 1701, and my argument, and this is the long-term solution, of course, and I always want to think about long-term because it's not okay to just cease fire and wait for the next round, because every time the next round, your opponents are Hezbollah and all the terrorists basically, and Iran as a source is always making sure that in the next round they are stronger and better and more ready. That's why I always think that the problem is not really just what Hezbollah has. The problem is that Hezbollah has the decision to go to war. The issue is state sovereignty. We don't have state sovereignty, and the only way to achieve state sovereignty in Lebanon and really give Lebanon back the decision of war and peace is to link 1701 to 1559. Really, this is the only way, because 1559 deals with the other side of the border, the Syria border, where the smuggling comes in. 1559 deals with stripping Hezbollah of their decision for war and stripping Hezbollah from being the actual army in Lebanon in charge of every single decision related to war and peace and other security issues. 1559 cannot be implemented easily. 1559 needs all the resources of the international community to be employed in order to make sure that Hezbollah is pushed back and at least some of 1559 is implemented. There's no successful 1701 if you don't resolve the Syria border. There's no resolution there's no implementation of 1701 and avoiding the next war if you don't really resolve the smuggling from all points of entry into Lebanon, including the port, the airport, and the Syria border. That's the only solution. It's exactly what's happening in Gaza and the smuggling in Rafah through Egypt. This is if you want Hezbollah to rebuild, their weaponry, then definitely you need to deal with the roots of supply. And I think this is the only long-term solution for this issue. Otherwise, it's going to be yet another ceasefire.
Well, listen, I think Hochstein has a near mission impossible. There's a big question out there about whether when Israel winds down in Gaza, even if there is no ceasefire, and I doubt there will be an official ceasefire, whether a declaration by Israel of an end to major combat operations would be an opportunity for Hezbollah to accept this Hochstein deal. This deal includes the movement of the Radwan forces back 7 kilometers or so to the Litani River, the deployment of Lebanese armed forces to the south, a reinvigorated UN interim force in Lebanon that has been interim since 1982, I believe, and which hasn't worked in implementing these resolutions, and a discussion about resolving disputed points on the blue line, which would give Hezbollah its divine victory by returning some 500 meters of territory to Lebanon. Maybe you could get there in the absence of a formal ceasefire with Hamas. I'm not confident because I don't think even the end of major combat operations in Gaza will signal an end to Israeli operations in Gaza. And so, there's a deal on the table. Is this enough incentive for Nasrallah? Does he not want war that much? We'll see. I think we'll know better in 2 weeks. But it's not looking good for the diplomacy. And I think part of the Israeli movement of forces to the north, assets to the north, is signaling, right? They may be ready to go. You may be ready to go. This may have already been determined. But I think the buildup not only of the rhetoric, but the messaging from the United States, the movement, is meant to force the action here, that we better get to this soon, or we're going to cross the threshold.
So, Assaf, what I'm going to ask you to do is comment on your assessment of U.S. diplomatic efforts, but also if you could throw in your assessment of the French proposal. There was a piece put out by the Washington Institute analyzing the alignment and the gaps between the American and French diplomatic plays. And of course, there's news that Mr. Hochstein will be visiting Paris in the coming days. So talk to us about, from an Israeli perspective, the Amos Hochstein diplomacy, but also the French proposal.
I'm not sure about that. I followed the exact details of the French proposal, but in general, I think we need to connect the dots between what we heard now. 1701, I think, correctly identified the fact that Hezbollah's weapons south of the Litani, out of the state control, were the key to why 2006 happened. And unfortunately, when you asked earlier today in this panel, how did we get here? We got here because the international community squandered 1701 since 2006. The UN said we can never verify Israel's claims about Hezbollah's weapons south of the Litani. And now we're watching a huge credibility crisis because, lo and behold, all the things that are flying, even in the last minutes over northern Israel, came from something that the UN couldn't verify. Since the beginning of the war, no more trilateral or tripartite meetings between the parties, which was one of the strong points of this mechanism. The UNIFIL forces stayed in their compounds, in their bases. They never even went to the hits, to the places where Israel hit military assets. And this could have been a fact-finding mission and monitoring mission. So I think we need to understand the following. One, the underlying problem of Iran supplying the proxies in Lebanon, in Syria, in Yemen, in Iraq, they're all spewing the same weapon systems against US forces, against Saudi Arabia, against the UAE, against Israel. It's all the same factory. And unless this network is addressed, it will be a resurging and re-emerging problem in Gaza and all the other frontiers. Second is that, okay, it's a good thing to try to avoid war by diplomacy, of course, and so on. But this will only touch the tip of the open exchange of fire. Then we will haggle over, Hezbollah will say, yes, I can take my forces back, but then only if the IDF does the same. Or we're actually buying something that we already paid for in 2006. Hezbollah shouldn't have had units south of the Litani at all. So when we talk about 7 kilometers or 8 kilometers, actually in most of the southern Lebanon, it's less than the Litani. And then it doesn't even address the core problem of high-level weapon systems threatening Israel's security. So I think that the best that diplomacy can get is to orchestrate a ceasefire and maybe some agreement. But after wedding, there is marriage. So they will sign whatever agreement there is. By the way, it will be the government of Lebanon, not Hezbollah itself. They will allow the leadership to decide on something. One of the mechanisms that is discussed, including with France, is having like an oversight group looking over what the UN is doing. But then there will be a question of blame games and so on. I think we need to recognize that the dynamic leading us here involved heavy exemptions for the giving the Lebanese government and armed forces free passes on their violations, their collusions with Hezbollah, and actually covering up instead of implementing their commitment. So I think we need to be very, optimistic that we'll have a ceasefire, not to stumble into a war, but also recognizing that it doesn't fix the root causes that might lead us to war sooner or later.
Thanks for that. We've had some questions which have mostly been addressed here, but I want to dive down on one of them before we close this out from the Zoom chat about the UN peacekeeping forces in Lebanon. And then since we've talked about that and you also noted some of the challenges with the Lebanese armed forces, I'd like to go back to David on this question. So first of all, I'd encourage you all to read a piece that was released by the executive director of the Washington Institute, Dr. Rob Satlaff, who talked about in it the U.S. President Biden proposal for the hostage release and ceasefire in Gaza was flawed in that the U.S. can work as a guarantor for Israeli compliance with the ceasefire agreement. But what's very clear is that when it comes to Hamas and Yahya Sinwar saying Egypt and Qatar will guarantee Hamas's compliance, what we've clearly seen over the last 9 months is nobody can guarantee the compliance or adherence to the parameters or terms of a ceasefire or diplomatic arrangement when we're talking about a terrorist organization. And in many ways, we're going to face the same challenges if we have success when it comes to Hezbollah and Israel with the diplomatic arrangement. So this gets to the point of who is going to monitor and verify Hezbollah compliance, not only in the near term, but in the medium term. And here, of course, there is a lot of thinking in Washington about the role that the Lebanese armed forces could play in filling in this area in southern Lebanon from which Hezbollah forces would withdraw. And then there's also this role for UNIFIL. So, David, I know you've worked for a long time on the issue of how the U.S. funds and trains and equips Lebanese armed forces. Are they up to this job, and who would make sure that they actually did what needed to be done on their side of a ceasefire arrangement?
Yeah, thanks. When you talk about who would monitor, I always say that the monitors need monitoring. This goes for UNIFIL. This will also go for the LAF, because of course the Lebanese armed forces won't be monitors. They will be deployed if this plan actually works. The initial number had been thought to have been some 15,000 to sort of flood the zone. You already have, of course, about 13,000 UNIFIL troops in South Lebanon. That's more peacekeepers per kilometer than any single spot on the world. I think they're now thinking about 6,000 UNIFIL soldiers in the south. It's still a lot on the border. There has been a presence, never a significant presence. The head of CENTCOM, the U.S. Central Command, military in charge of the Middle East, once said of the Lebanese armed forces, pound for pound, the best Arab military in terms of training, in terms of operational capability, et cetera, limited by funding. And so the U.S. assistance to the LAF had been, as of 2004, $1.5 million a year. That was strictly for military education, basically bringing Lebanese officers to the United States. After the Cedar Revolution, when 1.5 million Lebanese came to the streets and protesting the murder of Rafiq Hariri, the prime minister, by the Syrians and Hezbollah, and the Syrians left and ended a 20-year occupation of Lebanon, we decided that we should actually invest in the Lebanese armed forces, not as a counterweight to Hezbollah, but to do domestic security, border security, counterterrorism work, to not fight Shia terrorism, but the Sunni variety. We're talking about Al-Qaeda and later ISIS. And they do that. They did that. But along the way, and they developed capabilities, the United States built up its funding to around $200 million a year. This is equipment. This is standard, what they call FMF. And so foreign military financing, we provide them with the money. We decide what type of equipment they get. We provide them the equipment. They have used it at times very well. But, they are in the South. And when they operate in the South, according to UNIFIL, which during the last administration was decided they have to do a lot more reporting requirements about where they go, where they're obstructed, what happens if there's violence against UNIFIL, against the international peacekeepers. We learned in great detail how the Lebanese armed forces, as Assaf mentioned earlier, was actually obstructing UNIFIL from going to areas where suspected Hezbollah weapons presence, etc. After missiles were fired, the LAF stepped in and wouldn't allow UNIFIL to go investigate. They wouldn't allow them into villages. The Lebanese armed forces dismantled missile rails that were used by Hezbollah to fire rockets into Israel. There's a history of collusion, of deconfliction with Hezbollah. The Lebanese armed forces is an important institution in the country, but we have to recognize they are imperfect. And the last time, this is an organization that is made up of all the 17 different religious ethnic groups in Lebanon. The last time the LAF was called upon to do something against one particular religious group, Sunnis, I believe, in the beginning of the Civil War, the military units split, and the army ended up splitting along sectarian lines. And so they're never going to do anything that is against Hezbollah's interests, which I think is the bottom line here. It would be great if they were on the border and Hezbollah was not on the border. But at the end of the day, I think what we're going to see here is that even if the LAF goes, there will be Hezbollah that either go back to their homes or over time come back into Lebanon, into South Lebanon. Hezbollah, 2006, post-2006 is any indication, they cheat. And they will cheat and they will go back to South Lebanon. So regardless of what we do, I think a ceasefire would be a great respite for Israel, which has been fighting for 9 months already, to rest, to recuperate, to replenish their arms supplies, and prepare for what will be a much more challenging conflagration.
We're going to close this panel with one final sentence. I'm going to ask a question, and each of you can answer it with one sentence. We're going to start with Assaf and Israel, and then we'll go down the line from Matt, Hanin to David. How confident are you at this moment that diplomacy can de-escalate this situation in the coming weeks? And if it were able to de-escalate the situation, for how long? Assaf.
I would say very low probability, maybe 10%. And how long will it last? Until the next time that Nasrallah again believes that he can predict anything to specifically manage the brinkmanship and come home safely. And I think this hubris, and you smell the fumes of hubris in the air. It's so 2006. I've got them. I know how to do it. I will manage it. They can do nothing. Buckle up and prepare for surprises. Reality doesn't work like that.
Matt.
So I do think that Hassan Nasrallah for a long time has felt that he had Israel's number and he'd figured out what they would do and what they wouldn't do. We've written about this in the past. I think one of the big questions now is, does he recognize that that's no longer the case? Or even, is he a good enough reader of Israeli decision-making to understand that the Israelis are very, very serious right now? Is the diplomacy able to convince him that this redeployment has to happen? The Israeli population has to go home. It's going to happen one way or the other. And if he does, then just to outbid Assaf by a few, I'd say maybe 12, 15%. As to how long it lasts, I think part of the issue and part of the calculation for both sides right now is that neither side believes that it lasts more than a few years at most. I think both sides believe that at this point, we're coming to a head. Israelis across the political spectrum will say to you when you talk to them something along the lines of, after October 7th, we can no longer live with a gun to our head, not from the south and not from the north. And so there is this sense now that the kicking the can down the road while Hezbollah continues to rearm and resupply is over. And therefore, that if not now, then after a period of rearming and preparation, that there will have to be a moment of reckoning. And so I think that affects, in the moment, the potential for the diplomacy to succeed, even if it's moving in the right direction. If the war is going to come anyway, maybe it should come now, might be the calculation on one or the other part.
So we have 10% likelihood for diplomacy to exceed from Assaf, 12 to 15% from Matt. Hanin.
I would say 50-50. Not because diplomacy is very successful and not because diplomacy is really going to avoid war. I think diplomacy can work to achieve ceasefire, not an actual solution. Whereas if ceasefire, just a brief ceasefire for both sides to breathe and get ready, that might work 50-50, only because both sides really want a ceasefire. I think Hassan Nasrallah, Hezbollah, Iran, they are desperate for this to be over. Really, really desperate for this to be over. And I think Israel also needs some time to breathe and prepare and get ready. So I'm saying it's 50-50 because for a temporary ceasefire, not for a solution. That's a huge difference. For a solution, I don't think it will succeed at all. There's no one looking at an actually long-term solution. Hezbollah, just to give you an example why they're so desperate for all this to stop, they linked it to Gaza and they cannot unlink it. They cannot. It would look so bad if they just stop before the Gaza war is over, or they haven't any kind of justification to say that the Gaza war is over. It would look horrible. Whatever is left of the resistance rhetoric is going to be gone. But they are taking the losses, hoping that this is going to be over soon. But they're trying to get as much as they can from the negotiations. That's why they are escalating. Today, their military infrastructure south of Litani is gone, is eliminated. The pictures you see on these 5 kilometers south of Litani, there's nothing left. Hezbollah's military infrastructure there is gone. In addition to the fact that they have a commandment issue, from Mustafa Badreddin and before him Maghni to Qasem Soleimani to the new guys, which they don't really have a visionary. Their last victory, acclaimed victory, was with Imad Maghni, not even Mustafa Badreddin and Qasem Soleimani. There were many victories. They don't have a commander, a visionary commander for a war. They don't have a budget for the war. They don't have a budget for reconstruction of their own military infrastructure. But the most important thing is that the second class commanders, the top rank commanders, they lost 20 of them in this war, more than 20 of them in this war, targeted by the Israelis. The Syria scenario is now applied in Lebanon, where Israel is using this opportunity to target Hezbollah's military assets, really set them back slowly in a war. It could be more devastating for them without really risking Hezbollah's thousands of missiles falling into Israel. This is working more for Israel. Hezbollah, much more Hezbollah soldiers, militants have died this war than 2006 with less civilians. It's an okay situation. That's why they're desperate and they don't want it. Israel might want a break, but not a long-term break. That's why I would say 50-50.
So I think this is really interesting, this issue of whether or not Iran and Hezbollah are quite comfortable with the status quo or desperate to end it because of the losses, both Hamas but also Hezbollah, whether or not Hezbollah understands how Israeli society and national security thinking and strategic calculus has changed post-October 7th, and how that does or does not change the incentive structures and decision-making trees on both sides. So, David, take us home very succinctly, your optimism or pessimism about the likelihood of diplomacy to de-escalate, and for how long?
Well, it all gets back to Iran. The strategy of Iran via its proxies has been not to eliminate Israel in one shot. It's to make life intolerable for Israel, and that they'll just go away. They'll quit the country, they'll leave, etc. October 7th, the withdrawal of the Israelis from the north, Israel became very small all of a sudden. And this is viewed, I think, appropriately in Israel as being the beginning of a really existential question here. Part of it, we're not even dealing with the head of the snake here, with Iran and the nuclear threat that's coming down the pike. We're talking about the leading proxy. Everything changed on October 7th. So either there will be a change of status quo on the border, or there won't be. Now, Israel can live with the fiction that Hezbollah will cheat and they will come back. There won't be flags. There won't be major things along the border for a brief while. But sooner or later, because this is such a proximate threat, there's not early warning of the number of missiles, rockets, commandos, etc. Israel has a military of 180,000 standing army. You can't have 70,000 posted in the north on a permanent basis. This isn't going to work for the country. And so I think we've got a window here. We've got a window, like I said earlier, of 2 weeks or so when Israel, before Netanyahu comes to Washington, they wind down the major combat operations, make the announcement, and then we'll see what Hezbollah does. But regardless of what they do, and I hate the sound, I don't believe in fate, but there is, I think, a growing sense of inevitability about the need to change the situation in Lebanon, that having this terrorist army on your border, we're not even going to call it the militia, right? It's a terrorist army on your border, is intolerable. And so regardless of whether you get a deal or no deal, I think within a year or so, we're going to find ourselves in a similar situation.
Thank you so much for that. I have learned so much from this panel today. I hope that those of you still with us have also been enriched by the wealth of expertise and analysis you heard today. If you're interested in diving deeper on any of those issues, please visit our website, washingtoninstitute.org. Again, www.washingtoninstitute.org. We have a series of different maps tracking both Iranian actions, Hezbollah-Israel actions on the northern border, a plethora of analyses, both long and short, about every aspect of this conflict. So much to learn. So please continue to engage with us, and thank you for tuning in today. Take care.